Thank you all so much for joining us today. On behalf of the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health, I would like to welcome you to our webinar, Effective Interactive Training for Workers, with Alejandra Domenzain, MA and Program Coordinator of the Labor Occupational Health Program. A few housekeeping items first. You will be muted during this presentation. If you would like to ask a question, please enter it into the online chat or Q&A. There will be time to provide feedback using this online chat during the presentation. During these feedback sessions, we will share your responses aloud and will save all questions until the end of the presentation. When you exit the webinar, a link to the evaluation will become available in your browser. You will also receive a follow-up email with a link to the evaluation tomorrow, November 7th. Attendees who have participated in the complete live webinar today with an attentiveness score of 85% or higher will be eligible to receive a certificate of completion. Once you complete the online evaluation, you will receive your certificate as a PDF via email within a week. Attentiveness scores are calculated by our webinar provider and are based on continuous engagement throughout the presentation. Here are some tips on how to keep your attentiveness above 85%. Join the webinar on time and remain logged in for the entirety of the presentation. Do not use your device to navigate away from the presentation. If you are not clicked into Zoom as your primary selected window, your level will significantly lower. Checking emails or doing other work on your device continuously lowers this attentiveness score, so try to keep necessary distractions brief during the presentation. This is also a highly visual presentation, and if you navigate away, you may miss an important visual. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health YouTube page and on our website, coeh.berkeley.edu. The slide deck for this presentation will also be available by request. If you would like a copy of the slide deck, please email coehce@berkeley.edu. At this time, I'm pleased to welcome our presenter, Alejandra Domenzain. Alejandra is Program Coordinator of the Labor and Occupational Health Program at the University of California, Berkeley, where she is responsible for developing and overseeing projects addressing the health and safety of immigrant, low-wage workers in a variety of high-hazard industries. She started her work in the field of low-wage immigrant workers at National Council of La Raza in Washington, D.C., writing curricula and providing training and technical assistance to community-based organizations around the country. Then she worked with the UCLA Labor Occupational Safety and Health Program in Los Angeles, focusing on workers in the informal economy. At the Garment Worker Center, where she was health educator, advocate, and program manager. She went on to serve as assistant director of Sweatshop Watch, working on statewide campaigns and policy initiatives in coalition with other advocates of low-wage immigrant workers. Alejandra has also worked in the field of international development, adult education, and as a credentialed public school teacher in LAUSD for 5 years. She has an MA in Urban Planning and in Latin American Studies from UCLA and a Bachelor's in Science of Foreign Service from Georgetown University. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm so excited to do this. We're going to get started. So this is what we're going to cover in the webinar. First, adult learning theory. How do adults learn best? Then I'm going to take you through the 5 steps of developing a training plan. A lot of examples of interactive activities, which is something that people ask for in their registration. I'm going to spend some time on how to adapt materials for low literacy participants. And at the end, I'm going to give you a lot of links to resources that might be helpful as you plan your trainings. So this is a word cloud of, when you registered, one of the questions was what you wanted to get out of the webinar. And this is, represents 313 responses, so you might have to look really closely to see yours. But, what I understood is that the big themes are, most of you are doing training regularly and you're looking for, new and more, so new ideas, more strategies, really practical tips for training. And there's also a lot of interest in how adults learn best and, how to adapt for people so that it's not like very text heavy or PowerPoint heavy. So that I'm going to spend most of the time on those things. And I also love seeing from the questions just people's motivation to do better and be more effective. So I definitely share that goal. And I acknowledge all the work that you guys are doing. I'm going to try to make this presentation as interactive as possible, given the limitations of an online webinar. So there's going to be several points when you're going to see this image of the hands, and so I'll be asking questions, and I'm hoping that you'll be able to answer in your chat function. And also feel free to answer other people's questions, link resources that you want to share. And as I understand, all the chat comments are also available for us after this ends. So it's a good opportunity for us to learn from each other, because I also know from the registration that I recognize a lot of names of colleagues that I admire and respect and have a lot to say. All right, so just to begin, quick background, UC Berkeley's Labor Occupational Health Program, our mission is to promote safe, healthy, and just workplaces. And the way that we believe it's the best to do that is to actually build the capacity of workers themselves and their organizations so that they can take action to really make the changes that they want to see. So this affects the type of training we do, since we focus a lot on skill building. And because of a lot of our partners, mostly unions and worker centers and community organizations, they're very active in a wide range of campaigns. So our training is meant to support these efforts to help prepare workers to apply what they learn to really taking action in some way. LOHP does a lot of things. We do research, we do policy, but when it comes to training, this is a little snapshot. On any given year, we might train thousands of workers, most of them low wage workers, people of color, many of them are Spanish speakers. And then, we also train a lot of new trainers and community members, students, and health professionals. So this is your first opportunity to share, please, in the chat box. I would love to know from you, when you have been a training participant, what made the experience effective? Or if it wasn't, what do you think made it not effective? And so I'm going to actually go on, and then in a couple of slides, we'll pause to hear your responses. So you have a little bit of time to think and to type. All right, so when I say training for action, I want to illustrate what I mean. These are some of the kind of concrete examples of what it can look like. So this is a training that we did for recycling workers whose union contract was up for renewal. So one aspect of this particular training for action was to focus on what safety provisions that they might want to include in their contract. This is an example where we worked with the Healthy Nail Salon Collaborative, and they've been very active in pushing employers to protect workers from chemicals, among other things. And actually, they just passed a new law that to get more information about toxic materials. So in their particular case, what was important to them is that a lot of the businesses they were working for were small, had small business owners, low profit margins. And so their workers really wanted to know, how do you talk to employers to convince them and make the case for how a healthy workplace can help their business? And one last example is, this is a training of trainers program that we did, a leadership training that we did with the staff of the United Auto Workers and worker leaders who are organizing at the Tesla plant in Richmond. And so for them, an important part of what it meant to take action was to have strategies for workers to motivate others to act collectively, because they didn't have a union at that point to do it. And these three examples that I gave you, they represent really well-organized, really strong campaigns, but also training for action and leadership can also just mean that we want workers to be able to put into effect what they learn. So for example, for training community first responders, we want to prepare them so that they can play this leadership responsibility in their communities. Kind of the highest level of training for action is training other people to be leaders. And so we're big believers in that, because who better than someone who's deeply familiar with the industry and who other workers can relate to, right, to be the trainers. And so one example that we're doing now, last year and continuing into next year is Unite Here workers worked for decades to pass a COEH standard to protect hotel housekeepers from ergonomic injuries. And so now that it's passed, we're training workers to inform others about it and how they can use it to protect themselves. Another example is, this is a project that we did with janitors at SEIU USWW. And so they also worked really hard to pass a law that mandates sexual harassment training for all janitorial workers. And they actually got really strong language that it has to be in person, it has to be interactive, at least 2 hours long. And they just recently passed another law that elevates worker trainers and worker-led programs that we help them create. So I just wanted to mention this example because it's just such a great way where you see, you know, a union that not only believes in doing good training and with worker leaders, but actually got it codified into law that that's how it should be. So now I'm going to pause and have Michelle give us a little recap of what some of your responses were about your effective training experiences and your ineffective training experiences.
Great, thank you. And thank you to everyone who's entering their thoughts on the chat box. Some of the themes we've seen are interactive participation, involvement of attendees, otherwise it can be boring, opportunities to practice the skill that's being taught, trainers who are invested in the trainees' success, case studies and providing clear examples of how to apply what was learned, games, cultural experiential relevance, and some examples of ineffective training. We have too much data, not enough take-home ideas on how to apply it. A trainer sitting down and just reading through the computer, reading from slides rather than engaging students. Trainings that don't have room for participation. And also online click-through with just a quiz at the end and no interaction. And those are some of the main themes.
Great. Thank you so much for everyone that contributed. Those are such great examples. And actually, it's a really good segue to a lot of the themes that we're going to be covering next. So one of the things that someone mentioned was, you know, the clicking through and not enough examples for participation and also for applying and action. So let's start with that. Well, actually, sorry, before I go on, just if this is kind of your next question that you have to keep in the back of your mind to respond to is, what do you consider helpful to know about participants when you're developing your training? So as you're listening, type your responses for that. So let's start with adult learning theory. This is what we know about adults. Adults learn best when the training is relevant, right? Adults don't have time to waste on things that don't apply to them or they're not interested in. Also, training that respects participants. So at a bare minimum, this is, you know, treating people courteously, but really beyond that, for me, what it means is respecting the life experience and concerns that people bring and taking them seriously. Also, adults have a wealth of life experience, and so you want to build on that previous learning. If you're familiar with the principles of popular education, this is the idea that you start with where people are at and then you build on that. You know, people aren't blank slates, so making connections is really key. And then using diverse methods, everyone learns differently. And we're actually going to talk about that briefly, about different learning styles. And then, you know, for me, the key also, you guys mentioned participation. Training should be participatory and interactive, but in a meaningful way. So this is important. I've actually seen examples of participation where, for example, you know, participants go around and take turns reading some sentence from a handout with like very technical legal language. So, okay, it's participation. It's better than maybe someone just reading it out loud and being taught that, but it's not going to do much to help you, you know, understand the content. The other kind of big picture thing that we consider besides adult learning theory is that we want our training to be worker-centered. And so what that means is we really center workers' experience, right? Their realities, their concerns. So, for example, if you're talking about labor rights, you have to really acknowledge the vulnerabilities that come with being, for example, an undocumented worker and how, you know, that might impact how you're able to speak up. So if you're going to offer solutions, for example, you have to have a range. You have to have a range of things that somewhat are realistic for people. So this is an example of a handout we made where if you notice, you know, there's kind of some solutions towards this end of the spectrum that are pose less of a risk to a worker. And then as you progress up the scale, you see that it might involve more risk to a worker, such as retaliation by an employer, or, you know, maybe dealing with a government agency when you're undocumented. So we're going to start now with actual steps, right? If you're going to develop a training plan, what are the steps? We're going to go through these one by one. So for the first one, it's to do a needs assessment. And this is, I'd like to pause and hear, what do you guys like to find out when you're going to do a training? What do you like to know about your participants in order to design your training?
Great. So some of the responses that we've gotten so far, it's important to know what people want to get out of a training and what they're expecting from the training, work background, role in the organization and job duties, level of literacy, experience level and familiarity with the subject, dominant language, is attendance at a specific training voluntary or compulsory, and will the training be at the beginning or end of the shift? And those are just some of the responses that we've gotten.
Thank you, Michelle. Yeah, those are great responses. And I love the one about the role in the organization and then like how they're coming to you. Are they coming exhausted after the night shift? That's going to make a big difference in how you design your training. So yeah, thank you very much for that. Here's a little summary. I think it captures some of the things you said, and I'm glad that you guys contributed some additional things. So yeah, you want to know a little bit about your audience. You know, people mentioned their language, also their culture, their literacy level, formal education level. You want to know a little bit more about what do they want to get out of it? Why are they there? And that was a good point about when training is compulsory, right? The motivation might be much lower. And then what's their background? Have they already gotten training or information on this topic? And it may be good and you can build on it. It may be really bad and you're kind of up against bad information. That's important to know too. And how do they learn best? So what kind of written materials do you prefer? What kind of activities are going to work? And how they're going to use the information and skills, you know, especially for action-oriented training, that's key. So that's the first step, is you want to know, okay, what's the situation of the people that are coming to my training? And then you're ready to set your learning objectives. You know, all of you guys that are joining are experts in your field, and, you know, you probably want to be as helpful as possible. So you may be tempted to just pack it in, but this is where you have to be strategic, and sometimes less is more. So it's helpful to identify what's the absolutely essential thing that you want to make sure is addressed thoroughly. And then only if there's enough time and opportunity, then you include things that may be good to know or nice to know, but not, you know, essential. And when you're setting your objectives, don't forget, you know, that there's different types. So you might be interested in increasing knowledge, but also there might be attitudes or skills that you want to see. So one way to visualize this is as kind of the head, the heart, and the hands. You know, what do you want people to know? How do you want them to feel about a certain topic? And then what do you want them to be able to do? And I want to make a plug for the attitudes piece because, you know, someone can have the knowledge and skills to do something, but it's useless if they aren't really motivated to use it. And changing attitudes is hard. You know, it may involve unlearning attitudes that you've had for decades, and you can't just tell people, you know, what to think or how to feel about something. You have to actually create an experience that gives them a new perspective, which is the role of interactive and meaningful training, but you have to think it through. So for example, you know, we do a training with union leaders that have health and safety responsibilities. So if you have someone that starts out with the attitude, oh, you know, it's workers' fault if they get injured, they're just being careless, we just have to have more discipline. So that, you know, if you're able to change that attitude to maybe inviting them to look at the structural problems that might prevent a lot of issues, or like what are the root causes why workers are doing things a certain way, now you're in a place where they're ready for like the knowledge and skills to do it, right? But first they have to kind of believe that that's important. All right, so this is another question for you guys. We're going to talk a little bit about learning style. So think about yourself. What is your learning style? What are the ways that you learn best? And we'll come back to hear about that in a minute. All right, so you may have seen versions of this, you know, type of graphic. The point is there's different types of intelligences, and all of us have developed different ones to different degrees. And when you train, you want to appeal to people's varied strengths. Some people learn best by talking to others. Some people do best when they can move around and do stuff. Others need to hear or see. And for most of us who are in more traditional school systems, may not have had a chance to learn in different ways. So we don't have a lot of good models. And it can be really empowering now as an adult to realize, you know, oh, it's not that I was a bad student or I can't learn. It's like the teaching style was really limited, you know, maybe sitting still and listening to a lecture and then working alone and silently on a written worksheet. Like maybe that wasn't the best way to learn for me, but there are ways that work better. And so as a trainer of adults, now you have the chance to help people reclaim, that joy in learning, that confidence, and also get to know themselves as a learner. There's also different, versions of this type of graphic. The point is that it's a bad training assumption to think, I said it, therefore they learned it. Passively listening to a lecture is the least effective method for ensuring retention. So the more you engage participants, the more that you get to this bottom end where they're actually doing stuff, the more effective that the training is going to be. And it's not just retention, it's kind of the level of comprehension that you get that's important. So if let's say you're doing a lecture with, not much interaction, and people are, silent and they're nodding their heads and there's no question. So you might take that as a sign like, wow, they really got it. But you'll never really know, right? It could be that they just don't feel comfortable asking a question, or like their mind is actually wandering somewhere else. So it also gives you really good information. When you see people interacting, you kind of see where they're at and what needs to come next. So let's circle back and hear a little bit about your learning styles.
Great, we had a lot of responses. So some of the styles that people mentioned, we have visual, hearing stories, interactive and experiential, learning by doing. Another said see, do, teach, observing and doing. Reading. Someone also noted it depends on the topic. And then we also had constant participation, interacting with others, hands-on activity, and writing it down and taking notes, among many others.
Great. That's really interesting. And, it's good to think about what your learning style is, because chances are you'll be a little bit biased toward that. And so, you can kind of push yourself to make sure you're thinking about other types of learners that, learn differently from you. All right, so when you're selecting your teaching methods, the usual thing that we think about is there's a flow of information, right, from the instructor, facilitator to the participants. But when, your responsibility is actually to make lots of types of learning possible. So it's not just this, it's also, in a really good, rich learning environment, the instructor is also learning from the participants. Maybe learning about the subject itself. You're definitely going to be learning about participants and how the topic applies to their life. And if you're reflective, you'll also be assessing, what teaching methods are working or not for next time. And the best kind of learning sometimes is actually the learning that happens just among participants. If you're someone who gets nervous before teaching, I definitely still get like moments of panic before training, like, who am I to teach like anyone anything? And so it helps to remember that, okay, yes, you probably have something new to offer and you should be prepared to do it well, but also part of your job is to create a learning environment where people learn from each other. If someone asks a question, there may be someone else in the group that is more helpful in answering it than you, and that's great. And I can honestly say some of the most powerful moments that in trainings that I've done, they haven't come from something that I said or did, but from other participants contributing. So your role is just to create the space, the opportunities for that to happen meaningfully. Another kind of big picture thing to keep in mind when you're choosing your teaching methods is don't forget movement, especially in longer trainings. It can be really energizing. And humor or light moments, ideally would be part of the training activities, but if not, at the very least as like icebreakers and energizers. And don't be afraid of including emotion when it's appropriate. So I'll give you an example. The 3 women that you see here at the bottom, they're janitors who survived some really horrific sexual harassment and violence in the workplace. And we recorded their testimony about the impact that it had on their lives. And so now, the workshops that they do start with those testimonies, and they're really moving. And it sets the tone from the very beginning about how serious the issue is, and it takes the subject from something really abstract to something personal. So it's a great example, too, of how we were talking about before, changing attitudes by creating an experience. If someone started out the workshop thinking, the sexual harassment stuff, it's not so serious, people are just oversensitive, hopefully, listening to these impact stories will give them a different perspective. And that's how attitudes work. Often what changes your mind, it's not rational, it's emotional. All right, so what do we want from our participatory training methods, right? We want to engage people, both as individuals and teams. We want to encourage problem solving and skill development, learning through doing. We want to accommodate everyone's abilities and make a comfortable learning environment. One easy way to start doing that last one, is to have kind of ground rules and clear expectations at the beginning. So people feel, safe in what's going to happen. It's going to push their comfort zone a little bit. All right, so now I'm just going to give you a lot of examples of different types of interactive activities. All right, so brainstorm. So remember, brainstorms, the goal is to draw as many ideas out as possible without any judgment. And a lot of people don't feel comfortable speaking up in big groups. So if you want to generate a lot of ideas, it may help to do things in smaller groups or even pairs. One way to do it that can introduce some movement and social interaction is you put up like flip chart papers on the wall or scatter them around tables in the room, and then people walk around and actually answer the prompts on each of the sheets. And so that way when they get to a new paper, they see the prompt, but they also see what, people that have come before them, what they wrote already, and they just add to it. And also kind of cut down on repetition. And they may feel more comfortable bringing something up, in a more anonymous way. All right, discussion. So discussions can be very engaging, especially if there are different opinions, or different experiences. So this is an example of a question, that we use to spark discussion. And the take a stand approach is one that I love, because it's you ask people to stand up and physically go to different corners of the room that are labeled to show their response to like a statement or a scenario. So the corners could be labeled yes, no, somewhat, or agree, disagree, I need more information. And so while people are taking a stand where they responded, then you can ask them to justify why, and you can even add information or change the facts of the scenario, and then see, okay, does that change where you stand now, and explain why. And so it really helps people articulate their views, and then also analyze like what are the variables that influence them. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with role plays, and they tend to involve movement and humor, creativity, collaboration, and they're very valuable to practice skills. So for example, in this case, workers had to come up with strategies for convincing a supervisor to make a specific change. So they're actually practicing it. So when they actually go and talk to the supervisor, it's not going to be cold. They'll have like some ideas, right? Some body memory of having done it. And then depending on the group and the topic, groups might create a role play from scratch if that seems doable, but you can also provide a bit more structure. So maybe you can start with a scenario that goes wrong, and you ask people to make a role play for, how it could have gone better, or, what would be the next step to handle a situation. Games came up in the beginning as something that's effective. I mean, they increase focus and motivation. They can build camaraderie and, friendly competition. So these are some examples. This one is a board game that we use with youth. This is a bingo game that we use for labor rights. And this is a Jeopardy style game where you pick your category and your dollar amount and you play with teams. A variation on the bingo is where in order to like check off your box, you have to find something. So in this case, there's a table with an array of cleaning products and people have to read the labels to get information, and then they check it off when they find it. And you can also do it like as an icebreaker with people. So the box might say, find a person who, and then you have to find someone, go around and talk to people, find someone who matches what it says. So someone who's been doing this work for more than 10 years, or someone who's been injured on the job. These are games that are really great to review key concepts. So for example, Pictionary, where you have to draw something and your team has to guess what it is. Or Taboo is similar, but instead of drawing, you use words. So you have to describe what the thing is, but there's taboo words you can't use. And of course, those are the ones that like would give it away, would make it really easy. So you have to talk around it. It can be fun. There's some online games that you can use if your participants have smartphones and if you have good Wi-Fi. So make sure that's the case. Some of you may be familiar with Kahoot. So what's satisfying about these is that as you go along, it displays each team's responses in real time and then tracks the ranking of the teams after each question. So you can see who's ahead. It's like question by question. You can see where you stand. All right, so moving on from games, case studies are a great way to apply information to real life situations, and they capture people's imagination. Someone mentioned stories before. So, case studies can be really powerful, especially if they're based on true stories. So, for example, we use this case study of a temp worker who was crushed by a machine on his first day of work. And it's profiled in this documentary, A Day's Work. And the great thing about giving space for people to share their stories during workshops is that they can also serve as case studies, in the moment, and then you can capture them to use in future trainings. And sometimes in the moment, it's hard to get into a very detailed story, but you can always follow up with participants afterwards and ask them more about it, to capture that. You can create little short clips, like film clips as case studies to trigger discussions. In this case, as you can see, we had professional filmmakers, but you can just do a lot with a tablet and basic editing software as well. Okay, so moving on from case studies, problem solving is just immediately engaging, right? So you probably can't help yourself right now from looking and finding all the things that are wrong in this kitchen. So these are drawings that we use with restaurant workers, and we ask them to identify, what are the hazards that are there. And then after they have a chance to do that, we ask them, well, what would be ways to fix them? And we have an image of what it would look like if you address some of the problems. And we have these for lots of different industries. A variation on that is you can use real photographs with the kind of what's wrong with this picture approach. This is for training for workers doing cleanup after wildfires. Photographs can also be really effective for contrasting do's and don'ts. So these are materials we develop with La Colectiva, and so we stage the pictures with domestic workers demonstrating common tasks. And so then in the training, what we do is we give people the first one, we give them in a folder, right? So the cover of the folder has this picture, and they have to kind of strategize and think, what is it about this working position or movement that might cause pain? And then after they've come up with an alternative, they open up the folder and they see, the other picture of one possible solution that the workers came up with. Another problem-solving activity, I love this one, is where people just have to listen to a short skit, but they have to listen for clues to solve a mystery or answer a question. So in this case, it's why is one worker getting sick from the chemical exposure while the other one isn't? And so you have to listen to the dialogue to figure it out, and that you tease out the variables. And we said that adults are really interested in applying what they learn, new knowledge or skills in their own life. So these are all going to be examples now of application. This is one where, after you learn about different types of hazards, participants just draw their actual workplace and then label where can you find the different hazards. Another example is here, these are day laborers, and they learn about ergonomic risk factors, and then they actually act out common tasks that they might do in gardening or construction, and then they identify themselves, where are the places where they might feel pain and why it is. So they're really tying it to the risk factor. In this case of application, so participants were reviewing common factors, why some people perpetrate workplace harassment, and then common factors why people put up with it. And so there's different reasons listed on the little figures, but then they identify what dynamics are at play in their workplace, and then they make their own cutouts with those. And the ultimate application is when you're actually doing the thing that you're going to be doing out in the real world after the training is over. So in this case, the domestic workers are teaching about green cleaning, and participants actually get to do it to, hopefully be convinced that it works and it's something that they can do. Other examples of applications are, things like applying a bandage, or moving someone who's unconscious, where you actually get to practice, so when the emergency situation happens, it's familiar to you. All right, so we're still in the subject of teaching choosing your teaching methods, and a really important thing is making sure that you're adapting for language and literacy. So I'm a really strong advocate for quality translation and interpretation. It's a professional skill. Just because someone is fluent in a language does not mean they're a skilled translator. If I say to you, the budget she is advised to have within it enough numerous monies, you might get the gist, but it's much clearer if I say, I recommend that you put in enough money in your budget for professional translation, or at least a review of the translation that you did. And a good translator will also understand connotations and nuances. So, you know, a recent example is a colleague who was doing a workshop with Vietnamese workers about leadership development. And so they learned that the translation they were using for the word leader actually had really negative connotations from people's home countries associated with corruption and autocratic rule and that kind of thing. So they had to be careful to convey the very different concept of leadership that they were discussing. Another example is I was preparing for a training with electronics workers in Mexico about sexual harassment, and I learned about there's two different terms in Spanish for harassment. One refers to harassment by a peer, and then the other one by someone who's like a supervisor, has a higher position. And I'm a native Spanish speaker, but you know, when you're using specific vocabulary in a technical topic, it's a skill, and so you kind of need to do your homework. In any group, there's probably going to be a range of literacy skills, so you know you should plan for that. And one way is to avoid putting people on the spot to have to read something or write something. So let people self-volunteer, and it helps to say this up front, so you know people are at ease that if they have low literacy levels, they're not going to suddenly be asked to read something. And remember again that a lot of people have had really negative educational experiences where they've been shamed or felt like they were failing, and you do not want to replicate that. You know, another rule of thumb, don't just rely on print information. So make sure there's clear visuals that complement written messages. And then the more that you can adapt your presentation to be culturally sensitive to your participants, then the more that the examples will ring true. All right, so some examples of low literacy friendly materials. I'm going to show you a bunch here. This is from a project with forest workers. And so the first one is a digital story. So these are actually true stories of workers who got injured. And another great example of something that can change attitudes, right? Showing how serious it can be when you're injured is a lot more powerful coming from someone you know and or you can relate to. And then as part of the project, we also developed these written materials that are in a kind of comic book format with scenarios and realistic photographs and speech bubbles, which are really inviting to read. Here's a chart that we use to talk with day laborers about which rights apply when you're hired by a contractor versus a homeowner. And so, the icons here represent things like minimum wage and overtime, meal and rest breaks, heat illness, health and safety, and workers' comp. And so we go through scenarios and then we talk about, how does it apply when your employer was a contractor versus a homeowner? And I like this example because I think sometimes there's a misconception that if you make something low literacy, that you have to dumb it down, but that is just not the case. In this activity, we have really nuanced discussions about the intricacies of the law and its application and enforcement. So there's a big difference between dumbing something down and breaking it down and just making it accessible in different ways. For this handout, we actually were able to hire an illustrator to capture kind of complex concepts with very clear images. So if you can also get a budget to have an illustrator make pictures that are industry specific, that represent the demographics of the worker population that you're addressing, that you can field test for clarity, I mean, that is ideal. Here's a guide. This is from a guide for home health workers that relies on clear images to show what the do's and don'ts. And the use of symbols can be helpful, but of course, people have to be familiar with what they are. So in this case, the assumption is that the X is well understood to mean don't do this. Okay, so lastly, this is from a heat illness prevention training for farm workers, and it's meant to be done kind of tailgate style. So it relies mostly, there's very little text. It's mostly images, discussions, and then there's key messages that are on posters and then on bandanas, which are really popular because, they're actually really useful on the fields. So from that same training, you can see that the images, again, and the symbols are very clear about the do's and don'ts. And then the other really great thing about this project is it was meant for community trainers to be able to conduct short sessions in the field. So even the materials that are for the trainers are very low literacy friendly. So these are flip chart guides where in the front, there's a picture that participants see and triggers discussion. And then on the back, so this is in the back and the part where the trainer is looking at or here, those are kind of the points that the trainer needs to keep in mind for the discussion. So it's low literacy friendly both for the participants, but also for the trainers. And on that note, here's another example of the same thing where we did a training of trainers for this was a street level health project in Oakland. And so we needed, we had great lesson plans for training day laborers like at their center, but we had just ideal training conditions. We had 2 hours, we had a really comfortable environment, we could do role plays, we could put stuff on the walls, but they were interested in developing something that was for day laborers who were just standing in the street. So it had to be quick and it had to be very different. And so we worked with them to develop, these materials where not only the materials are very engaging for the participants, but a volunteer or an outreach staff could just, with very little preparation, just take the trainer's guide and go out and conduct the session. So you have to make sure, that your materials are working for everyone involved, the trainer and the participants. It may be that new trainers have a lot of experience with the subject matter, but they're new to training. Or it may be that they're very experienced trainers, but they need a little support with the content. Or it may be that they're both new to the content and the training, right? So you have to keep that in mind. So this is the day labor training. And then just to show you, this is what participants get like after the training on the street. And so includes the photographs that they saw in the presentation and then some key. All right, so this is the last one. So this is with domestic workers. We worked really hard with them to develop the materials that the trainers are going to use. And then part of the TOT was actually, the first time that they did the training, we co-trained with them or observed them and take notes and debrief. And then I think almost every single time I've ever done a TOT and then observed the new trainers training, I've wanted to make changes to the trainer's guide to make it more user-friendly, more clear. So if you can do that, I think it's really helpful to see how it's being used in action. Okay, next question for you guys is, what do you assess from your training? What kind of evaluation do you do, and how do you do it? What are the instruments that you use? And while you're answering, we're in step 4, which is whenever possible, you want to pilot test, you want to train, check out whether the methods and materials you thought were great are actually working with sample participants. And if you can't do this, officially your first workshop kind of serves as your pilot. So make sure for not just the first one, but for all of them, you debrief, you reflect, and you're continually making changes to improve what you have. For me, I find that if I'm excited to teach something, it's a good sign. It means I feel confident about the plan, or I'm curious to try out something new. And if I'm not excited to do it, maybe that the plan has started to get old or just isn't very engaging, so I'm kind of dreading it. Or, if you're bored with what you're doing as a trainer, then there's no way that you're going to spark interest in others. So keep it fresh, change it up, try new things. All right, so in assessment, now we're getting, your workshop is over and you want to know, did it work? And so just a reminder that you're going to have to come back in your learning objectives, to both the things that you want to see for change in knowledge, change in attitudes and skills. So you can either have, just something at the end that you use to capture it, or at the beginning at the end, so you can see the change. And if you ever have the opportunity to do follow-up evaluation later, like a few weeks or months after your workshop, you can get really valuable information about, how much do people remember, or how people use the information, or have they shared it with others, or are they doing anything different as a result of the training? All right, so let's hear from you. What are some of the other things that you assess and other ways that you do it?
Great. We had lots of responses. Some of them included SurveyMonkey, asking learners if they've learned something new, seeing content reception and retention through quizzes and evaluations, written evaluations and questionnaires. Someone else likes to talk to the participants on the floor and ask if and how they're implementing the training, and what they would have changed, if anything, to make it more understandable. Another person commented they like to assess learning in a variety of ways, written and verbal, so everyone has a chance to display their knowledge in a way they're comfortable with. Some other people noted observing workers, asking questions to gauge their new knowledge. And someone else likes to do assessing knowledge prior to the training, knowledge gained after the training, and feedback on the training itself, among many others.
Thank you, Michelle. Those are all great ideas. And I love that some people included like during the training itself, you're getting relevant information. And, you know, again, just to keep in mind that you don't want people to feel kind of on the spot. Like we have a project where we had to do kind of pre and post tests, but we didn't call them pre and post tests. We called them like surveys, you know. So yeah, but thank you for sharing all those. All right, so I mean, I think you guys have, you know, covered a lot of this. You want to know, was there a change in knowledge, attitude, or skills, but also the effectiveness of what you did, the materials you used, was it appropriate, and just some things about the logistics of the training as well. Was the, you know, the space comfortable, that kind of thing. And you know, I think, yeah, you guys mentioned too, written or oral test or questionnaires. And you know, the beauty of doing interactive training is that as you go along, you're getting a lot of information about where participants are at, right, and the activities and presentations that they're doing. So they have chances to show kind of what they're learning, you know, in real time. So don't discount those. It's not just, you know, the little quiz at the end. It's also what you're observing, and if you can make notes of that, that's useful too. Okay, so some examples of low literacy evaluations. So this one on the left relies on happy faces with kind of keywords. So usually we read out the questions and then people just circle how they felt about it. And then the one on the right, it was actually designed for a training program we do with workers with intellectual disabilities, but it's also a really great example of you know, using images as answer choices, and which is a great low literacy option. This is another one where, so there's two circles. So one is an outer circle and then one is the inner circle, and people are facing each other and you tell them, you know, move over 3 spaces or whatever it is, and then you give them a question to discuss with their partner. And later, after they've done a few rounds of that, people share what some of their partners told them. So it's nice because it maintains, you know, some of the anonymity, because you never really know who said what, which is also, you know, something I recommend for evaluations, is not having names, because people can be really honest about, you know, their opinions. And you want to hear the negative feedback. That's sometimes the most important, right? Like what you could do better. This is one where we give participants these signs that say like yes on one side and then no on the other. And then we ask them questions and they just hold them up. And then this is just like where the, you know, trainer reports like who said yes, who said no. And if you're wondering, why don't you just like ask people to raise their hands, yes or no? It's because sometimes if like everyone's raising their hand yes, then you feel intimidated to be the one person who says no. So with the signs, it's just more private. You can't really, it's harder to like look at everyone's. All right, so getting to kind of key takeaways that I want you to have from this training, which is, you know, you want your training to be appropriate for the population. And so you have to know your audience. It's going to be a lot more useful if it's action oriented. So for this, you need to know what people want to do with the information, right? What are their goals? And then you want to have confidence that, activities that enhance confidence and leadership, and, you know, both the head, but also the heart and the hands. I also want to just mention some resources. So on our website for LOHP, we have a multilingual guide with worker training materials. And by the way, all these resources, you know, you'll have the links live pasted into the chat function, and then they'll also obviously be on the recording of the webinar, and they'll also be in the slide deck later. So I want to also acknowledge we have 2 kind of sister programs that do great work with interactive action-oriented worker training at UCLA and Davis. And they actually have been partners with us in developing a lot of the trainings that I've highlighted in this webinar. National COEH, the Council for Occupational Safety and Health, if you're not familiar with it already, is an amazing resource. So they have a lot of multilingual health and safety training resources. Their annual conference is coming up December 3rd to the 5th, which brings together health and safety educators and worker leaders. And then they also run a listserv where it's just the best. You can ask a question and then you get responses from the best health and safety advocates and educators all around the country. Federal OSHA has a grant program that some of you may know about called the Susan Harwood Training Grants. And so for all the grantees that have been participants, they actually, make their materials available to others. So you can go on their website and you can look for, what other people have developed throughout the years by topic, by language, or by grantee. And they also, OSHA has developed a guide that's kind of a best practices for the grantees, but it really is actually a really great resource for anyone that wants to do interactive training. It covers, as you can see in the contents, it covers a lot of things that we've talked about today. So check that out. Hesperian Health Guides is a nonprofit health education source, and they also have a lot of materials in multiple languages. And these are all sources of information for how to adapt materials to below literacy. And these are, very comprehensive guides because there's a lot of research on this and it's like a real science. So, just to give you like some technical tidbits to give you an idea, it includes everything from how you organize content, like having consistent subheadings, to your sentence structure that you use. It's better to have short active sentences and like long passive sentences, or design features like using left justify instead of centering text so there's not uneven spacing that's hard to read. So there's like it can be really technical, but it's really important, right? Like we know how to do this. And so if it's something you want to do well, I encourage you to get more informed. All right, so to conclude, I guess I want to remind you, training matters. This is a letter that we got from an inmate in Soledad prison, where we do a 3-day course for inmate workers. And you can imagine it might be hard to be hopeful about your ability to make change as a prison worker. So I found this letter particularly moving. And he says, "This program has changed the way I look at everyday life. I will not take advantage of watching unsafe things go on in the workplace. I will not look another way. I will teach it as well as practice it in everyday life. This program has opened my eyes to new possibilities in my career. And I thank you for this knowledge." So when we train, we give people tools that make a difference. And for me, that's the magic of training. It's much more than just a transfer of knowledge. It can be an opportunity for people to come away with new skills, new confidence, new motivations, new hope. And in this time of so many attacks on workers, creating a place where you can say, you're safe here, you're respected, your experience is valuable, your opinions matter, I believe in you, I'm here to support you, you have rights, you deserve to be protected, we can do this together. That is really no small thing. So this is us. This is a recent staff picture, and it's meant to convince you that we're very approachable and fun to work with. I hope it worked. But we really love working in partnership, collaborating on little and big things, learning from others. So please contact us if we can support you in any way, or if you have ideas for working together. And we have some time for questions. And so please, again, I encourage you to ask your questions and answer each other's questions in the chat. And then I have questions for you, because I would love to learn from your experience. Like, do you have resources to share on any of these topics? I would love to know. And then do you guys have best practices for making online learning interactive and meaningful, which is something that we're exploring more. So thank you, and I'll open it up to Michelle to read out some of your questions and comments.
Great, thank you so much. Yes, if you do have any questions, please do enter it. There's the online chat. There's also a Q&A function. One of the first questions was regarding whether these slides will be available. Yes, we do. We have recorded this webinar. It's going to be on our website, coeh.berkeley.edu, and also our COEH YouTube channel. And if you want a copy of the slide deck, you can email coehce@berkeley.edu, and we'll get those sent out to you. Another question, someone wanted you to go into a little bit more detail about the 2-circle discussion method.
Okay, sure. So it's we talked about movement being important and social learners. And so this is a way to kind of get beyond the sit down and fill out your form dynamic. And so there, you divide up people into 2 groups. So one group you say, please form a circle. And then the second group you say, okay, form a circle inside, face your partner. So they're facing each other. And so you might say as a first question, please talk with your partner about, something that surprised you or something that you found interesting in the training. And so they have, a couple minutes to talk with their partner about that. And then you say, all right, if you're in the inner circle, please move, clockwise 4 spaces. Or if you're in the outer circle, move, to the right 2 spaces. And so they do that. And so now they're facing a new person. And so then you ask a new question. And the question might be, what was missing? What would you have done differently in this training? And, that they have a chance to talk with a different person. So by the end, they've talked with several different people about several different things. And then when you, go back to the classroom, you can say, all right, so what did people hear? What did you hear from others about, what they thought was surprising or interesting? And then they share. But again, because people were all mixed around, you don't necessarily know who said it. So it gives people a little bit of an opening to, to have opinions, and to be really honest about it.
Great, thank you. We do have a couple of comments. Someone wanted to let everyone know that they do safety training for nail salon workers. And one thing that has worked really well has been incorporating an ESL component, because that's something that most of the workers are interested in learning, and the majority of them are new immigrants. And then someone else also posted some resources in that center chat there. We do have another question. Someone was wondering some of the more effective methods when conducting tailgate training.
Yeah, that's a great question. And our sister organization in UC Davis is a great resource for that. So I encourage you to contact them. But I think, some of the things are what I mentioned, that it helps. You have to know how much time do you have? It's probably going to be brief, right? Because people are in the middle of their workday or just about to start. You have to, I would assume that, they're going to be at a distance from where you are. So you need something really visual, and at a size that people can see from a distance. And even if you notice in the picture that I showed, people were, people always keep their distance. They always sit in the back row. They always, no one moves right up. Let's see if I can find it. But so you want, you can see here, right? You want this person to be able to see what's going on. And then, because this was meant to be low literacy, you really wanted to just draw on people's experience and have it be not about some, a text, but just the text is their lives, right? So engaging in discussion and problem solving, talking about the topic, and the things that are handed out in the end are really just key points. It's kind of key images, key messages, but the real learning happened not from what was, printed somewhere, but kind of from what was said from workers.
Wonderful, thank you. We also had someone who wanted to share that one of the documents they really like by OSHA is the Resource for Development and Delivery of Training to Workers. And again, those links are available in the chat for you to check out. We also have someone who was wondering about the number of participants where the training is most effective.
That's a great question. I think it'll depend on what you're trying to do. We found for, most of the trainings that we do with interactive activities, it's actually having too few, it isn't helpful, because then it's hard to have a kind of a group dynamic. And if you want to have teams for a game or that kind of thing, you kind of lose a little bit of the momentum. So, but then if you have a really big group, then it gets harder for everyone to participate and share back and all that. So there's no magic number, it depends a lot on the subject, it depends on the length, on, all those things. But as a rough guide, for me, the sweet spot is somewhere between like 15 and 25. That it feels very personal, that I still feel like I can connect with people, they can connect with each other, and you can still do cool group dynamics without it being overwhelming. And it also helps a lot if you have a space, a room that's flexible, if you can get up or move around or break out into a different, area and that kind of thing. And when it's a big group, usually you can't. One of my least favorite trainings when we had to do it was an auditorium, and it was 200 people and the chairs were bolted to the ground. How do you do small groups? How do you, besides turn to your partner, it was just really limited what we could do, to be interactive in that setting.
Wonderful, thank you. And I just reposted the links again, so there's a long list of links in the chat that you guys can all have access to. We do have time for one more question here. On the topic of making trainings actionable, how in your opinion do you ensure actionable steps are taken given the limitations of some attendees of trainings that they may have in their work environments?
Yeah, that's a really important consideration, and it's something I was saying that, when you talk about worker-centered training, that you really have to understand people's realities. And so I mean, the way that we've tried to do it is, you know, in the your needs assessment, really understand like what are those limitations that people have, and you may not have the answers. You know, honestly, most likely it's going to be other workers, right, that are really knowledgeable about the situation, that are going to be able to come up with strategies that are really useful. What we try is just to at least have lots of options. So, you know, I'm coming back to this one because, you know, people are at different steps of their journey, right, and what they're able to do. So maybe someone like they just need to start with something really small that's just in their control, and that does not risk their job. It doesn't, you know, there's no risk involved. And, you know, maybe with someone that has a lot of like a union behind them, or, you know, collective action or other, they are able to kind of take it a step further. So choices always help. And also non-judgment, you know, kind of like, it's like the worst thing you can do is like, well, you know, if you don't call this, you know, government agency, basically it's you're failing, you're just doing nothing. Well, if that's the only choice you're giving them, and it's not a realistic option for them, it's almost worse than giving them that, just because now they feel bad, like they're not taking the action that you suggested. So choice is always helpful, and you know, being realistic is always helpful, and get the help of people themselves. They're the ones who's going to know what will work for them or not.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again so much for joining us today. Special thanks to our presenter and all of our attendees online. COEH hosts webinars the first Wednesday of every month from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Pacific. Our next webinar is going to be Wednesday, December 11th with Dr. Robert Harrison on severe silicosis and engineered stone fabrication workers. We also have an ergonomics webinar series in cooperation with the NIOSH Education and Research Centers throughout the country. And this next webinar will be on November 20th on patient handling from patient migration to repositioning with Dr. Kermit Davis of the University of Cincinnati. Be sure to check our website for more information and to register. That's coeh.berkeley.edu. And thank you for all of your wonderful questions and participation in today's webinar, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day.